Hi everyone, Maryann here, author, New Thought leader, and district president at the International New Thought Alliance. Today's guest is Mitch Horowitz, and he and I both appear in the New Thought film that's going to be released in October called As a Man Thinketh. So let me tell you a little bit about Mitch first, and then we'll go to the interview. Mitch is a PEN award-winning historian and author of books including Occult America, One Simple Idea, How Positive Thinking Reshaped Modern Life, and Mind as Builder, The Positive Mind Metaphysics of Edgar Cayce. Mitch has written on everything from the War on Witches to The Secret Life of Ronald Reagan for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Politico. Mitch is vice president and executive editor at Penguin Random House. So stay tuned for my interview with Mitch. Welcome, Mitch. Thank you for appearing on my show today.
Good to be here, thanks.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. In researching your work, you are what I would consider to be almost like a New Thought scholar or an expert. So this is so cool to have you here today.
Thank you.
Yes, and Mitch, you appear in the soon-to-be-released New Thought film, As a Man Thinketh, directed by our friend John Miller. And the film is based upon the book, As a Man Thinketh, by
Yes.
James Allen. Yes, and Mitch, it's a small but mighty book. It's almost, yeah, it's like a long essay. It's incredibly deep. And Mitch, can you tell us why this book is important in New Thought?
Well, not only is it one of the most popular inspirational books ever written, but it's the kind of book that you can find in households, and for centuries you've been able to find in households where the term New Thought is never heard. You can find this book in the offices, the pockets, the personal libraries of people who would never consider themselves interested in mysticism or metaphysics or mental science or New Thought, and to whom in many cases those terms were alien and weren't in any way part of their day-to-day life. But that was James Allen's genius. He was a mystic. He was someone who was deeply attached to the new metaphysics, the mental, mystical, causative philosophies that swept through the United States and Europe and other parts of the world in the early 20th century, New Thought, Christian Science, divine science, and so on. He believed in the core principle that thoughts are causative, that character is destiny, that what you think about all day long is not only a barometer, but a cause of what happens to you, that your thoughts themselves are causes and not results in your life. And he was very familiar. He was British and was very familiar with the American New Thought tradition, was deeply attached to it. And after a long and very steady and serious spiritual search, he came to believe that, in fact, the core philosophy that you would find at the heart of every religion was essentially the New Thought challenge, which is that character is destiny. Thoughts are causative. There is a very thin tissue of separation between mental and spiritual experience, and that insofar as the individual is modeled in the image of Creator, that is true of us in our mental lives. Insofar as creation is this causative, penetrating force that creates all we experience, all we see, all we know, thus too our minds, this causative, penetrating force within our own worlds, within our own frame of reference, within our own plane of existence. So He believed very deeply in an idea that's at the center of New Thought philosophy. He was very much part of the New Thought tradition, and his book broke through to people and households and communities where the phrase New Thought would never be heard.
Exactly. So many people have the book or have had the book over the years, of course, not even realizing that this is sort of the core message of New Thought. So that's pretty fascinating because everybody knows of this book. I mean, so many
Yes.
people. Yeah, so that's pretty incredible.
Remarkable. Yeah, including people who are from walks of life religiously who might not view New Thought necessarily in a favorable way. This book is
Yes.
popular among conservative Christians and evangelicals, people who, if you were to lay out a New Thought philosophy or metaphysics or doctrine, would say, wait a minute, I'm not so sure about that.
Right.
But
They would be like, no way. Right.
right. They're quite sure about what they find in that book. He had the genius more than a generation before, say, Norman Vincent Peale came on the American scene. He had the genius to state New Thought principles in a way that was just pristine and truthful to the principles themselves,
Yes.
couched in language that was accessible to both a church-going and a secular public. He just demonstrated that ability to speak to everyone, and that is where his greatness comes from.
Right, right. And that's why it rose to be so popular in culture. So, so Mitch, I want to ask you a little bit about specifically in the book, starting actually right off the bat, right at the forward, actually. James Allen writes, and this is a quote, he says, "This little volume, the result of meditation and experience, right, is not intended as an exhaustive treatise on the much written subject of the power of thought. It is suggestive rather than explanatory."
Yes.
And I wanted to focus in on the words that he used, the result of meditation and experience. Oh, in your opinion, what does that mean? And what are your thoughts on that line?
Well, James Allen was, I would say, first and foremost, a contemplative. He spent a lot of time in nature. He spent a lot of time by himself. He spent a lot of time very carefully studying the religious philosophies of the world. And he had really been on a lifelong search by the time he published As a Man Thinketh in 1903. And ironically enough, Allen himself would not even live for another 10 years. He died at the age of 47 in January of 1912. So
right.
He was in his late 30s at the time that he wrote the book. He had never been in good health. He died less than a decade later, probably of tuberculosis. And although his life was short, it was this tremendously active life in which he dedicated himself with such solidity to finding time for his sense of spiritual search, which for him very often involved meditation, long walks in nature, reading of scripture, prayer, study of the world's religions. And by the time he wrote As Man Thinketh, which was his second book, his first book was a book called From Poverty to Power, which had come out a couple of years earlier. By the time he wrote As a Man Thinketh, when he was in his late 30s, a young man, by today's standards, but he was a man who was in shaky health and would not have more than another decade in front of him. By the time he wrote that book, it became almost this complete expression of everything that he had come to feel was essential in the spiritual search, truthful to all religions and actionable. He felt that the book was one that could serve almost as a handbook to living out a meaningful, complete, concrete life. He seems almost to have felt the sense of time at his back and how precious little of it there was. And he didn't waste a word. He didn't waste an insight. He didn't waste a sentence. In As a Man Thinketh, even though he would write other books, he boiled down his life's philosophy, and it really was a road-tested experiential philosophy, into this very slender, precise statement. And that too is part of the book's greatness. It's a work of such great economy.
Right, exactly, because some of his other works are certainly longer and even have chapters and things like that, but this was certainly short but precise and just amazing work that he did. And I think the idea of the result of meditation, it's almost like sort of an inner knowing, or just like how do you think that these ideas and thoughts get to these folks like Holmes and, you know, the Fillmores? It's almost like it's in the ethers and they're just receptive to it. What do you think
Yes,
about that concept?
I think that's true.
Yeah.
All of these folks that you just mentioned, Ernest Holmes, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, James Allen, they were more or less contemporaneous of one another.
Yes.
They
Yes.
were deeply, deeply searching people. They seem to each have received a spark of inspiration at some point in their lives. Very often that spark of inspiration came either through Christian Science, through the teachings of Mary Baker Eddy, or through the teachings of Emma Curtis Hopkins, who had been one of Mrs. Eddy's closest students, but they had a fracture, and Emma went off on her own and became a founding voice of New Thought. But usually one of these thought systems, you know, something coming out of the new metaphysics, sometimes something coming out of transcendentalism, which was a generation earlier, touched off a spark in these people. And, you know, that they took that kind of precious bit of leavening, and they used it to embark on a search that became individually their own. And unlike our experience today, there wasn't this enormous amount of metaphysical and spiritual therapeutic literature floating around, you know, and
Right.
in some regards that may have really been an advantage. You know, I mean, if you grew up in a New England household in the late 19th century, as many of these people did, or, you know, were raised in the Midwest like the Fillmores, or in central industrial England like James Allen,
Yes.
you may have been raised in a household where there were very, very few books. There may have been a copy of scripture, maybe a couple of devotionals, maybe a couple of inspirational books. There was some light reading at school, you know, depending on your situation. But there wasn't a great deal to choose from. So when folks like this would come in contact with the ideas of an Emma Curtis Hopkins or a Mary Baker Eddy or a Ralph Waldo Emerson or what have you, I mean, they would drink up these ideas like a person who was parched would drink up water from a fresh spring well. You know, it was
Yeah.
unusual. It wasn't something to take for granted.
Like overload that we have now, for instance.
It's such an overload, isn't it? I
Right.
often wonder if my own search, frankly, is not impeded because I can turn around and just pull a book offline or off my phone or off my shelf anytime. You know, I go out to lunch and I say to myself, well, gee, what should I read at lunch today? And it's a nice privilege having all these books that I can access digitally or on a consumer site or off my own bookshelf or what have you. But, you know, I do wonder sometimes whether it creates a kind of mental fogginess and doesn't allow us to take seriously one idea that we allow to deeply, deeply penetrate. You know, I mean, all the folks that you just mentioned, you know, they grew up in circumstances where they were either living in industrial or agricultural circumstances, modest backgrounds economically. They didn't have access to a lot of books. And when they found gold, they knew it and they valued it and they treasured it and they used it in the service of their own search.
Yeah, that's a great point in the sense that it's almost like they had that chance to deepen and just absorb it and to, you know, more than we do in this, you know, society. Everything moves so fast and it's just so fast, you know. That's amazing.
You know, I wonder sometimes if I only had access to Ralph Waldo Emerson's first series of essays, maybe I'd be better off, you know. Maybe
yeah, we would be.
What our forebears are telling us, rather than just saying, well, I'll just reach for someone else who puts it in a different way or a more pithy way. I do think religious novelty helps us. I do think we need open doors. I do think we need signs and messages and symbols that ignite our search. But these people, boy, they were not in a position in life to ever take anything for granted. And they didn't take things for granted. When a good message reached them, they knew it and they worked with it with a great deal of passion.
Yes. Great point. And that kind of brings me kind of to the next question, which is kind of like, there is a difference between reading and experiencing these thoughts and concepts. And what are your thoughts on that? 'Cause it's almost like James Allen, for instance, he experienced them and wrote about them, but we can relate to what he wrote. But many times when we experience it, actually, because I think on some level, when we do read this material, we know it's true. I personally believe it's an inner knowing that we all share.
Yeah.
But it's always amazing when something happens personally, for instance, in my awareness, where I realize, yes, this is true. This is the way it is. What are your thoughts about the difference between reading and experiencing?
Boy, that is not only a wonderful question, but it speaks directly to something that I'm going through right now as a seeker. I have been thinking very much over the past few days about the caution not to just be hearers of the word, but to be doers of the word. And speaking for myself as a seeker, as somebody who is every bit involved in his own search in all these areas that we've been discussing, I think, frankly, I can find it almost too easy sometimes to hide in the words, to become a hearer of the word, and to think, well, if I read just one more translation of the Hermetica, I'll understand X, Y, and Z. Or if I can remind myself of something, then I'll understand it. And there may be some merit to that, but the truth is, it's more challenging, and we almost have to stand more naked in front of ourselves and reality when we attempt to be doers of the word. My head is so filled, frankly, with new thought ideas that
there's so much. It's almost overwhelming sometimes, right?
I wonder if I ever need to go back, and read another page of Emerson or Ernest Holmes as long as I live. I mean, of course I will, and I'm
or Neville. I love Neville. Yeah.
Yes, and Neville, who's one of my great heroes.
Yeah.
But having read these figures with so much passion and so much dedication for so many years, I frankly have to wonder, and I say this seeker to seeker, I have to wonder if sometimes another book, another lecture, another pamphlet doesn't just become like a form of hiding from me. And maybe I don't need to reread another book or to find a new translation or to embark on a new study. Maybe I need to be more of a doer of the word.
Yeah. Maybe put it all down and just go forward, right?
And it may occur to me that, gee, it's not so easy going forward.
I got to keep reading.
Yeah, and now I'll go back and I'll read again. But I'm not sure that that's the answer because I think one can hide, in being a hearer of the word. One can hide in it. And I know in my heart that James Allen was a doer of the word because his books, and As a Man Thinketh is probably the prime example, although there are others. His books are really the result of personal experiment, and they didn't come from any place else. He was not syncing up various religious systems so much as he was personally experimenting. And these books are a record of his own experimenter, of his own life as an experimenter, of his own life as a doer of the word. So he serves as a personal example in that regard.
Yes, absolutely. Well, actually, Mitch, we're almost out of time. This has been such a great conversation. But I don't want to miss the opportunity for you to tell folks, the viewers, where they can connect with you and to share your latest projects, if you would.
Sure. Well, there are a couple of ways to connect with me. If you throw my name into Google, you'll find your way to my website. And there's lots of links and articles there and other things. On the website of the New Thought movie, I have a essay about James Allen's life. And it's worth looking at that to see what there is in his lived story that can serve as a source of guidance, as a source of inspiration. Because these books are really echoes of James Allen's own footsteps.
Yes.
And if we can learn about his life, which was a life filled with many, many challenges and difficulties. His father died when he was 15. He had to leave school and go to work in a factory, and there was so much that he faced, and it was a more brutal world that he grew up in, that many of us do today, living in central England in the Victorian age. It's important, I think, to look at Alan not only as an author we admire, but as a figure who can serve as a source of guidance in how he lived his life. So that's what I try to do in that essay, and you can find that on the website of the New Thought movie.
Yes, super, super. Well, thank you, Mitch. It was such a pleasure. And I know everyone's just going to love this interview because it's just very interesting and thought-provoking.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Mitch. Have a great day.
Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. So there you have it, my interview with Mitch Horowitz. That was a lot of fun. So for more information about me, please visit my website, maryannpatalano.com.